job. You've got a federal prosecutor that's been on the case for weeks. But think back about the hearing back in April. That's where we began the discussion of this part of this interview about where he is now and trying to understand what went down in 2016. Let's start there. I remember at the hearing about a month ago, you said you're still trying to get your head around everything. What are you trying to figure out?
Well, the first step is find out exactly what happened. We're trying to get our arms around that, getting all the relevant information from the various agencies, and starting to talk to some of the people that have information. You know, the thing that's interesting about this is that this was handled at a very senior level of these departments. It wasn't handled in the ordinary way that investigations or counterintelligence activities are conducted. It was sort of an ad hoc small group, and most of these people are no longer with the FBI or the CIA or the other agencies involved.
This appears to run deep. Why is it so hard to figure out?
Well, there are two things here. One, no one's really looked at it. I think there's a misconception out there that we know a lot about what happened. The fact of the matter is, Bob Mueller did not look at the government's activities. He was looking at whether or not the Trump campaign had conspired with the Russians, but he was not going back and looking at the counterintelligence program. And we have a number of investigations underway that touch upon it, the main one being the Office of Inspector General that's looking at the FISA warrants. But as far as I'm aware, no one has really looked across the whole waterfront.
So you came into this job and you started asking questions. Did you get any answers?
Well, I thought when I came in from the outside that all the questions that I had and many other people had that would be readily answered once I got in, but I haven't found that to be the case.
You also said back in April that you thought there was spying going on in the Trump campaign. When do you think that started?
Well, I'm not going to speculate about when it started. We're going to find out when it started.
It's been said that it was July of 2016. Does that sound right to you?
Again, I don't want to speculate. What I will say is that you know, I've been trying to get answers to questions, and I found that a lot of the answers have been inadequate. And I've also found that some of the explanations I've gotten don't hang together. So in a sense, I have more questions today than I did when I first started.
Some of what things don't hang together?
Some of the explanations of what occurred.
Why does that matter?
Well, because I think people have to find out what the government was doing during that period. If we're worried about foreign influence, for the very same reason we should be worried about whether government officials abuse their power and put their thumb on the scale. And so I'm not saying that happened, but I'm saying that we have to look at that.
Can you say when Bob Mueller knew there was no collusion with Russia?
No, I couldn't say that.
No date given?
No, I couldn't say when he knew.
That controversial anti-Trump dossier and how it may have been used by intelligence officials.
Bill is live in San Salvador with more. Bill, hey, great stuff from out there. Good morning.
Hey, guys. Thank you. Good morning again from the capital city, San Salvador. The video you see of us walking there is at a jail about 30 minutes west of here. The capital city, MS-13 gangs is a big focus of his trip down here, to make sure that the law enforcement agencies in El Salvador know that the United States has their back. It's a big push that goes on here in Guatemala and Honduras, these Northern Triangle countries that we talked about just about 30 minutes ago. With regard to the investigation matter now, it is clear, based on our interview and discussion, that he has a roadmap as to what he is looking at and, frankly, how far he's going back. In this portion of the interview, some specific questions about the FISA court, about the dossier, and about the previous intel officials who are no longer in government. That's where we start this section. How do you think John Brennan and James Clapper handled the Russian investigation?
Well, again, I don't want to speculate about the facts because I don't know the facts at this point.
At all?
I know some facts, but it's premature to be discussed.
Can you tell us what the Steele dossier had to do with this? What role did that play?
Well, that's one of the questions, that we're going to have to look at. It's a very unusual situation to have opposition research like that, especially one that on its face had a number of clear mistakes and a somewhat jejune analysis, and to and to use that to conduct counterintelligence against an American political campaign is would be a strange development. I'm not sure what role it played, but that's something we have to look at.
Do you smell a rat in this at this point?
I don't know if I'd describe it a rat. I would just say that the answers I'm getting are not sufficient.
Just to follow up on that, Republicans have said for months that these men, Brennan, Clapper, maybe James Comey, had it in for Trump. Do you think that's true?
Again, I'm not going to speculate about their motives.
In the period of time between Election Day and the inauguration, did anyone in government or in intelligence, did they take action to justify their decisions?
Between Election Day, did you say?
Between Election Day of 2016 in November and Inauguration Day.
I think there were some very strange developments during that period. That's one of the things we want to look into.
Such as?
Such as the handling of the meeting on January 6th between the intelligence chiefs and the president, and the leaking of information subsequent to that meeting.
Was that meeting in New York City?
Yes.
In Trump Tower?
Yes.
What questions do you have about what happened that day?
Again, I'm not going to get into that.
But it's on your mind.
That's one of the things we need to look at.
Can you characterize how far advanced you are in understanding that meeting?
We're still in the stage of gathering all the information.
And the reason why that's all important, if we go back in time, in January of 2017, you're within that period before the president's sworn in. James Comey is meeting at Trump Tower in New York City, pulls the president aside, briefs him on the dossier, makes him aware that they are aware, and then, as James Comey has said, he left that Trump Tower meeting, went out to Fifth Avenue, got into his black SUV, and then transcribed the notes from his meeting. So hang on to that bit of information. Clearly, that's a bit of a sign or an indicator as to what Bill Barr is looking at now. In the meantime, you have Democrats who, again, they are hot on his tail for a number of issues. They believe he lied before Congress. They believe he overlooked the obstruction suggestion that was in the Mueller report. They believe that they can now hold him in contempt of Congress, and look for that perhaps in the month of June. Also, they believe there was witness tampering. Specifically on that question, as it relates to the former lawyer for the president, Don McGahn, when posed with that question about whether or not he considered witness tampering once he got the Mueller report, Bill Barr explained his decision this way.
That's a misconception. He was not asked to change his testimony. That was a reaction to a press story in the New York Times that claimed that Trump had told him to fire Mueller. And Trump, and this, I'm just going by what the report said, I'm not arguing the case, but Trump was mad at the word fire and claimed he never directed McGahn to fire Mueller. And in fact, elsewhere the report does say that McGahn was told by Trump to talk to Rosenstein to complain about conflicts of interest that Mueller had and have Mueller removed for conflicts of interest. And there's a difference, because if you remove someone for a conflict of interest, presumably someone else is going to be put in to continue the investigation. And what Trump was being accused of in the New York Times was just outright directing the firing of Mueller.
And there's another aspect of this, too. Remember, Democrats claim that Bill Barr held the Mueller report back, put out his own principal conclusions first to try and spin the story in the favor of the White House and the president. I asked him specifically about that spinning. He said, shooting right back to Democrats, saying that they didn't have the opportunity to spin the story themselves. I'll just make one more point, Sandra and John. Going back to the Steele dossier, in his own words, Bill Barr describes that dossier on its face. It had a number of clear mistakes. So how was it used? In which hands did it go? Why was it approved? All of this, again, is part of that investigation. An investigation, I will point out, that could take a very long time. 12 months is not a short period of time for the way the legal process can work in the U.S. And with regard to the Inspector General's report, remember, 2 investigations currently underway under the purview of Bill Barr. The IG report apparently is not finished, he told me yesterday. He has not seen it. It is not ready to be made public. with regard to this investigation. It could be some time before that new federal prosecutor really gets into the meat of what was going on in the intelligence community during the Obama administration, especially that period of time between Election Day 2016 and Inauguration Day, the third week in January.
Bill Barr saying he believes the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation and that he can understand why the president is so frustrated with all of the aftermath. And back to you now, Bill, for the next part of this big interview as we await more. Bill.
Yes, Sandra, he talked a lot about Nancy Pelosi. He talked about Bob Mueller, his relationship with him, his relationship with Donald Trump, what he thinks about James Comey today. I'll get all that in a moment here. But remember what the president's position has been from the beginning. Called it a hoax, called it a witch hunt, and I asked the Attorney General about that.
Mueller decided not to attempt to subpoena or force the issue with the president, so he made that judgment. I did say the White House cooperated, and what I was referring to there was the truly unprecedented delivery of information in the form of millions of pages of documents and the ability to interview White House staff, including the president's White House counsel, with no holds barred, no privilege claimed at that point or anything. So that was unprecedented, and that's what I was referring to when I said the White House.
So you find that satisfactory on behalf of the White House?
It's more than satisfactory. And Bob Mueller obviously felt it was satisfactory. He reached his conclusions in his report.
Let me come back to that point. The president calls this a witch hunt. He calls it a hoax. Would you agree with that?
Well, as I've said, if you were the president, I think you would view it as a witch hunt and a hoax, because at the time he was saying he was innocent and that he was being falsely accused. And that's, if you're falsely accused, you would think that something was a witch hunt. And I have to say, you know, when you step back and look at this, two and a half years of his administration, 3 years of Trump, you know, the campaign and then the first part of his administration, he has been hammered for something, you know, for allegedly conspiring with the Russians. And that, we now know, that was simply false.
Are you comfortable using those words? Witch hunt? Hoax?
I use what words I use, and it was an investigation, but I think if I had been falsely accused, I'd be comfortable saying it was a witch hunt.
You mentioned Bob Mueller a few moments ago. Were you surprised that he came back with no recommendation on that obstruction charge? That surprised you?
Yes, that surprised me. Because the function of a prosecutor is to make a call one way or the other.
Did you ask him why?
Yeah, we discussed it.
What did he say?
Well, you know, I already have said that we met on March 5th before he delivered the report, and he gave an explanation for it, and it's pretty much reflected in the report.
You're okay with him testifying?
Absolutely.
He works for you?
Yes.
Or under you?
Yes.
Or did? What seems to be the holdup? Jerry Nadler said this week it will happen soon. Perhaps it happens in June or not. Do you have any information on that?
My understanding is that Chairman Nadler is talking this over with Bob Mueller and his staff and trying to schedule it.
So you expect it to happen?
I have no reason to think it won't.
Do you believe members of Mueller's team around him put pressure on him to include certain aspects in that report?
I don't want to speculate because I just don't know.
Do you believe he gave in any of that pressure?
I don't want to speculate. I really wasn't there to watch the interaction of his staff.
Yeah, a lot of this now, just a bit of context here with regard to the Mueller stuff. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal just this morning. It went online last night about the holdup with Bob Mueller's testimony in the House. There could be executive privilege matters that would prevent Bob Mueller from answering a lot of these questions. So there's a debate as to when this happens, and some are making a case that it could be pushed off even further. I think the first part of that answer, though, it needs a little bit of context as well. Democrats have been leveling heavy charges against Bob Mueller, saying that he's protecting the president. He's doing all the spinning here because he said the White House fully cooperated with the Mueller investigation. But there was no sit-down interview. It was only a question and answer, only in writing. Remember, this was a focus of Rudy Giuliani and Jay Sekulow, the president's attorneys, for about a year's time. They did not want the president to sit down, fearing a perjury trap on behalf of those on the special counsel. So a little more context on that. Now we move into more criticism on behalf of Democrats. Democrats. Remember, Nancy Pelosi calls him out as a liar for his testimony on the Hill back in April and the 1st and 2nd of May. Now, just this week it happens that Bill Barr and Nancy Pelosi saw each other on Capitol Hill. Let's go back to this exchange, and starting with the House Speaker. Now, let's move further into that aspect of this, because you are being heavily criticized by Democrats, by the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. She believes you lied under oath. What do you think of that charge?
Well, I think it's a laughable charge, and I think it's largely being made to try to discredit me, partly because they may be concerned about the outcome of a review of what happened during the election.
What does that mean?
That means they may be trying to undermine my credibility, but obviously you can look at the face of my testimony and see on its face that there was nothing inaccurate about it.
You reportedly had a conversation with her this week.
Yes.
What did you say to her?
Well, I wouldn't call it a conversation. It was more like an icebreaker. I was introduced, and I asked her if she had brought her handcuffs with her.
And she said?
I didn't really quite hear what she said, but she wasn't unpleasant about it.
What she will say, and Democrats will say, is that you were spinning on behalf of the president with the principal conclusions that you released. They leveled charges that you held back the Mueller report for several weeks. Were you spinning for the White House to buy some time?
No, I wasn't. I think what they're really perhaps annoyed about is that they didn't have an opportunity to spin, and that the fundamental findings of the report were out there for everybody to see, and they were not in a position to spin. A few more headlines here with regard to Bob Mueller. He's okay with him testifying. He's got no reason to say he won't, as he just referred there. Said the relationship after 30 years describes them in the following words: we're still friends. With regard to his relationship with the president, calls it a good relationship. In his words, a good, candid relationship. And then you've got the issue of James Comey, who just this week, Sandra and John, said that Bill Barr has lost his soul. When I asked him about that specific comment, he said, those people are not concerned about my legacy. And so it goes. More coming up in a moment here from San Salvador.
Very interesting stuff. Bill, thank you.
James Comey has a lot to say about you. He recently said that you've lost your reputation. What do you think of him?
Well, I've noticed one of the talking points these days is, oh, isn't it a tragedy? You know, Barr is losing his reputation, or his legacy is being tinged because of his service in this administration. I don't think those people are really concerned about my legacy.
That's Attorney General Barr responding to criticism from former FBI Director James Comey, as Barr now reviews the origins of the Russia probe, which began on Comey's watch. Chris Swecker is a former assistant director of the FBI and joins us now. Chris, you've been hearing some of what the Attorney General told our Bill Hemmer. What do you think about the probes that are underway, multiple probes actually, into the origins of the Russia investigation?
Well, first, I think Bill Barr has got the knowledge and the skills and the experience, and he's got a pretty hard bark on him to withstand all the criticism. He's not worried about what people are saying about him. And I think he's making some hard decisions and some hard calls that need to be made. We know that there are some red flags up there. How the dossier was used in the FISA application, whether the investigation that took a well-predicated investigation on Russian interference into a presidential campaign was appropriately based on factual information and sufficient to justify opening the investigation. We know that there were extensive leaking. When you leak, you have an agenda. So the question is, did some of the investigators, especially at the executive level, have some type of political agenda? So I think it's entirely appropriate to look into it. He's picked the right guy in John Durham. We also have the Inspector General looking at it. I'm starting to finally get a feeling that we're actually going to get to the bottom of the thing.
Here is more on what the Attorney General had to say about what is prompting or what he's looking for in these investigations. Listen.
I think people have to find out what the government was doing during that period. If we're worried about foreign influence, for the very same reason we should be worried about whether government officials abused their power and put their thumb on the scale. And so I'm not saying that happened, but I'm saying that we have to look at that.
So obviously the FBI has tremendous power, and the Attorney General wants to know whether the FBI or maybe some other agencies were trying to steer the election one way or the other.
Sure, electronic surveillance, FISA, even criminal surveillance using electronic means is the most intrusive technique they have in the toolbox. It's been entrusted to the FBI and other agencies. And if they can do that to a political campaign, what can they do to an ordinary citizen? So it's entirely appropriate to look into it. Predication and in terms of factual information that reaches a threshold to open an investigation is an important part of this puzzle, but also the FISA process itself, being truthful in FISA affidavits, being fulsome in terms of your disclosures of the information that's in there. You have to disclose information that might contradict the information you provided. Use of paid informants and how they're used and how that information is used is critical. What's important here is and I've said this earlier, is to make sure that we know what happened so we can make some reforms if we need to. We can shore up some processes. And if mistakes were made or things were done deliberately, then we can make sure it'll never happen again.
Chris Wecker, who